Boyd Cohen from Iomob. Thank you very much for joining us. Congratulations on another win. Now, what struck me earlier is that the very last video that we recorded, PhocusWire, at a live event, was an interview with you at the Travel Technology Show, or Travel Technology Europe in London in February. And one of the very first video interviews from one of our events that we have done since then is with you. So, you know, we've almost kind of bookended the COVID crisis in a slightly absurd and maybe awkward way. But, you know, it's...
I'm going to be forever related somehow in your mind to COVID.
I fear you. I fear you will, Boyd. No, no. Jokes aside, I mean,
part of the post-COVID world, please.
I mean, jokes aside, congratulations on winning. I mean, you won the battleground at TTE in February, and you've just won again here for the Critics Innovator of the Year award. So well done. Just a couple of questions, really. I'm curious about, because, you know, one of the core things about Iomob is that you help public service transit operators, local authorities, councils, as we call them here, state authorities in the US, whatever, with trying to connect the different dots around public transportation and last mile and all those kind of things. And what I'm curious about is, what is the appetite for that now, given what we've just been through over the last 6-7 months? I.e., is that kind of integration and connectivity a priority still, or do you think it's become a bigger or lesser priority than it was, say, in February when we spoke to you?
Good question. I would say, first, I would say you're right that a lot of our projects have been with rail operators. Like now we're working with London Northeastern Railway in the UK and Renfe in Spain and Transit Authority in Sweden. So you're right that a lot of our current customers have been that more public sector facing. So I can answer with that regard, but I can also say that we're starting to work more and more with private sector companies that are related to travel, transport, or even other industries that are adjacent, like insurance or OEM car manufacturers, who also want to offer this kind of seamless mobility experience. So the specific question you ask about the perception or the interest level from public sector authorities to embrace micromobility as part of a first and last mile to public transit is accelerating in Europe because of COVID. So, you know, you're based in the UK, I believe. In the UK, they've made very proactive efforts, and I think there's £1 billion now from the government to help cities around the country embrace, around the region, embrace micromobility, expand their physical infrastructure to support more walking and micromobility uses, so that people don't, what people are afraid of, what transit authorities are really afraid of, is you have even your own prime minister saying publicly it's better to avoid going on transit right now, which there's an argument that it might be, because it's a crowded place, and depending on ventilation, it might not be a great socially distant place to be a lot of times. So the transit authorities are saying, how do we ensure people don't go back to the cars? We actually did a webinar called How to Avoid Carmageddon Post-COVID. And that Carmageddon is this idea that everyone will go back to their car because it feels safe. I'm in the car by myself. I don't have to worry about being exposed to someone else. And so transit authorities are saying micromobility is an important part of the solution post-COVID, because even if people aren't comfortable in public transit, they can be comfortable if they're outdoors on a scooter or a bike. And so what we need to do is create more space for those, less space for cars, and accept that over time people will migrate back to public transit, but then they can use micromobility as a first and last mile solution. So what we're seeing is an acceleration, and the UK is particularly accelerating right now with a bunch of trials happening all around the region for new micromobility services. So it's actually a good time for what we're doing.
And one hopes that this is all kind of tapped into the sustainability agendas of whether they are private companies, public authorities, regional, national, or even multinational kind of government organizations, that what you're talking about does at some point trigger some kind of sustainability nerve, and perhaps everyone gets it. Whereas I sense before, perhaps pre-2019, that perhaps many organizations didn't get it.
Sustainability is a journey we've been on as a society, humanity, for decades, ever since the Industrial Revolution, when we abandoned our connection to the planet, or at least our understanding of our connection to the planet. I think in the last couple of decades, we've seen, growing number of large companies, certainly the public sector, embracing how can we be part of a lower carbon economy. I wrote a book in 2009, published in 2011, called Climate Capitalism, which was looking at all the different business models that actually help us accelerate our path towards a low carbon economy. So it's been an ongoing dialogue. You look at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and what some of the covenant and mayors in Europe have been doing. There's a lot of effort. In Europe, you have the Green Deal now, which has several $billions. Maybe it's going to approach $1 trillion over time, I think. Focused on how to transform the entire pan-European economy to be low carbon. I think there's growing interest across the entire spectrum. And if you look at the private sector, who's been generally slower about this, they're catching up. And I think one of the interesting reasons why they're catching up is that their employees, the younger ones, and their customers are starting to demand more transparency and more sustainability, or they even boycott them, or they choose other more sustainable brands. So I think we're starting to see it becoming very mainstream.
And I suppose it's difficult to say whether what we have, as I said earlier, what we've been through in the last 6 months accelerates that as well. I think one of the trends from talking to many people in the industry, as we have over the last, as you say, the last 6 or 7 months, is that, there is this big reset button that many are pressing, and the smarter ones are pressing that reset button with a view on just thinking a little bit more holistically about how we all kind of fit into all this. Whereas perhaps, and I think that's across the travel kind of value chain, that we are seizing the opportunity, or we should be seizing the opportunity, given that we are in this kind of reset kind of period.
I like the way you just restated what you were saying, that we've reset and are relaunching a different model for travel that's sustainable. I don't think we're there yet, but I think the consciousness about it has been elevated. The dialogue about it has been elevated. The world is paying more attention now because we finally saw clean skies in cities that have been consistently polluted and contaminated, and people who live in those cities saying, wait, you mean I didn't know the sky was blue? That's the color? Oh, you mean I don't get sick and I don't have blood coming out of my nose? I mean, there are cities like that, like in India. I've been there, when literally my nose was bleeding from the contamination in the air. So the awareness is being raised on a global scale. I think obviously the airline industry is struggling harder than most, because it's harder for them to massively transform the way their vehicles fly in the air in a way that's zero carbon, compared to, say, the OEMs. The car manufacturers are accelerating the development of electric vehicles. We're seeing an acceleration of the deployment of EV charging networks. We're seeing acceleration of electric micromobility services. And I think we're going to start to see, and at Iomob, we're working on this now, and I think airlines are going to start playing in this area. Airlines are limited to some extent to how much they can do, how fast, regarding the actual plane. But they can do a lot on the door-to-door journey and a lot of other elements of their users' journey experience that are more sustainable. What kinds of foods are available on the plane, how much paper is involved with ticketing and all the rest of it. And how do their users get to and from the airport, and how do they get around the cities where they get to? And that's where Iomob comes in, because we offer a much broader range of mobility services for their passengers, and we can enable eco-filtered journeys. And we think what's coming is that some of our customers, like airlines, like other rail operators and others, are going to start finding ways to incentivize their customers to choose lower carbon options.
Yeah.
The easiest thing is taking the nearest taxi. But what if we give you extra miles if you chose a search for a EV only vehicle?
Yeah.
These are different things that are, they're subtle, but this is called nudge theory in transportation, around nudging people to more sustainable choices. So
Yeah.
I think we're going to see the private sector relating to mobility, finding ways to encourage users to embrace more sustainable choices, and then leverage that to create stickiness in their app or more customer loyalty or something else.
It's interesting, and I guess a final point really just to note is that it's a shame that we do have to incentivize to achieve those things, but if that is the only way to get some kind of traction that then leads to scale, then so be it, right?
To be honest, I think even incentives are not enough. And this is even more of a shame, but I actually think from tracking the sustainability adoption for the last 20 years, you have to regulate a lot of this if you really want it to happen. Like we're seeing countries regulating that over the next 10 years, there will be no more new internal combustion engines manufactured in our country. Well, if you want to accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles, you have different ways. We say, here's a cool electric vehicle. It costs 6,000 euros more or 6,000 pounds more, but over 10 years, you'll save money on gas. Okay, that's one model. A second model is, well, we'll subsidize as a government so you can get your car for only 3,000 pounds more, but it's electric, so your ROI, your return on investment, will be faster. Mm-hmm. Or a third model is say, guess what? You can no longer circulate a vehicle that is not electric. Well, you want to figure out which one's the fastest way to get electric vehicle adoption. It's the regulated. So right, that has to be part of it too.
Okay, well, I'm glad we managed to talk on some slightly more broader topics than what you were talking about in your presentation earlier. I mean, I've always been interested in some of the other things that you've had to say. So Boyd Cohen, again, thanks ever so much for joining us. Congratulations on your win at Phocuswright Europe 2020. And I hope that we'll see you soon in a live environment.
Post-COVID.
Post-COVID, indeed. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.